The first time it happened, I thought I caught a stomach bug. My husband had opened another bottle of Pinot Noir, his third, or maybe the fourth, I'd stopped counting, and I was curled up on the bathroom floor of our house in Naperville, pressing my cheek against the cold tile because it was the only thing that felt real. The room wouldn't stop spinning. I could hear laughter drifting in from the kitchen, glasses clinking, someone telling a joke I'd never get to hear the end of. By the time I made it back to the couch, pale and shaking, everyone had their coats on. My mother-in-law patted my hand and said, "You always push yourself too hard, sweetheart." My husband gave me that look, the one that said "not this again," and started collecting wine glasses like nothing had happened. I was 29 years old. I'd never had a stomach bug last 6 months. We'd started the wine club the previous spring, my husband and I. It was his idea, technically, though I'd been the one who actually made it happen. I sent the invites, I bought the cheese boards, I ordered the stemware online and hand-polished every glass before the first gathering. We hosted every 4 weeks, rotating through different varietals. His sister came every time. His coworker Philip and Philip's wife came most times. My friend from the pharmacy where I worked usually made it when she didn't have her kids. It felt like the kind of life I'd always wanted. A house with a dining room big enough for a real table. A husband who knew how to talk to people. Gatherings that felt warm and adult and chosen. The first time I got sick, I blamed the brie. The second time, I thought maybe I was getting migraines. My mother got them, so I told myself it was hereditary. It was hormones. It was the change in weather. The third time, I threw up so violently I burst a blood vessel in my eye, and my husband held my hair back and said, "Maybe you should stop drinking at these things. You clearly can't handle wine anymore." I stopped drinking at the next gathering. I poured myself sparkling water with a twist of lemon and sat at the head of the table feeling slightly embarrassed, slightly relieved, completely certain that whatever was wrong with me would now stop. I was sick again by 9 o'clock. Worse than before. I didn't tell anyone that detail, that I'd been sober and still ended up on the bathroom floor. I'm not sure why. Something about saying it out loud felt like opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. So I kept it small, kept it quiet, filed it in the back of my mind under things I'm not thinking about right now. My husband suggested I see a neurologist. He said it with such genuine concern that I almost didn't notice he never offered to come with me to the appointment. I saw the neurologist. I had an MRI. Everything was normal. I saw a gastroenterologist. Everything was normal. I went gluten-free for 3 weeks. Nothing changed. My mother-in-law started calling more often, checking in, which should have felt kind but somehow felt watchful. His sister, she was over at our house more and more, even on weeks we weren't hosting. Sometimes I'd come home from a shift at the pharmacy and find her car in the driveway, and my husband would explain that they'd been going over some family paperwork, some old thing about their parents' estate. I didn't press. I was so tired all the time that pressing on anything felt like too much work. I had been with my husband for 6 years, married for 3. We met when I was in grad school finishing my pharmacy degree, and he was already established, already confident, already the kind of man who seemed to know exactly where he was going. I admired that so much at 23. By 29, I was starting to understand that a man who always knows where he's going doesn't always bring you with him. The thing that broke open wasn't dramatic. That's the part that still surprises me when I think about it. It wasn't a confrontation or a phone left unlocked on the counter. It was a glass. The 5th wine night, I poured myself water again from the start. But this time, I don't know why, maybe instinct, maybe something that had been building for months, finally pushing through. I watched. I actually watched. I watched my husband pour. I watched him move around the table with that warm host energy he had, filling everyone's glasses, laughing at something Philip said, leaning over to say something in his sister's ear that made her glance at me quickly before looking away. I watched him pick up my glass, the one I'd placed at my setting with water already in it, carry it to the kitchen for more ice, and come back. I drank the water. 20 minutes later, my vision started blurring at the edges. I didn't go to the bathroom. I sat very still and I breathed through my nose and I watched the room tilt gently sideways while everyone laughed and talked and refilled their own glasses, and not one other person at that table looked even slightly unwell. I drove to a hotel that night. I told my husband I needed air. He seemed relieved. I've worked in clinical pharmacy for 5 years. That means I know what benzodiazepines look like on a tox screen, and I know which ones dissolve clear in water, and I know that certain compounds at low doses over a long period of time can cause exactly the symptoms I've been experiencing: the dizziness, the nausea, the feeling of the room pulling away from me like the tide going out. I also know that my husband's sister manages the medication inventory at the assisted living facility 2 towns over. She has access to things most people don't. And I know that what I'd seen her slip under the table to my husband during the third gathering, which I'd assumed at the time was a phone charger, a small envelope, something boring, was the right size and shape to be a vial. I sat in my hotel room with the TV on mute, and I made myself think about the life insurance policy my husband had taken out on me 14 months ago. I'd signed the papers without reading them carefully because he presented them during a week when I was exhausted from a double shift and said it was just something his financial advisor had recommended. I'd thought, that's responsible, actually. I'd thought, he's planning for our future. $250,000. I threw up in the hotel bathroom, and this time it had nothing to do with any substance in my body. I did not confront him. This is the part people always want to know. Why didn't you just confront him? And I understand the impulse behind that question. I do. But I had just realized that the man I shared a bed with may have been slowly poisoning me for 6 months, and that his sister was likely helping him, and that there was a $250,000 policy sitting in my name waiting to pay out when I died. Confronting him without evidence would have meant giving him time to dispose of whatever he'd been using. It would have meant being alone in that house with him when he realized I knew. I'd read enough case files in my training to understand what happened to women who tipped off the wrong person too early, so I did 4 things instead. First, I called in sick to work and spent 2 days in that hotel room writing down everything I remembered. Every gathering, every symptom, every timeline, every small detail I'd filed away as nothing. I wrote it by hand in a notebook I bought at a CVS 2 blocks away. Second, I called a pharmacist colleague. I trusted completely, someone who had no connection to my husband, someone who owed me nothing and therefore had no reason to protect me out of pity. I told her what I suspected. I asked her what I should be looking for. She told me. She also told me to get a urine sample tested before the substances fully cleared my system, and she told me exactly which private lab in the city would run a comprehensive tox panel without requiring a physician referral. Third, I called a private investigator. I found him through a recommendation from a divorce attorney. Yes, I called a divorce attorney first, before anything else, because I needed to understand what I was entitled to before I moved a single piece. The PI was a former DEA agent named Strickland who had a small office in Oak Park and who, when I laid out what I believed was happening, said very quietly, "Ma'am, you need to let me do this right." Fourth, I called my mother. I told her I was fine. I was just visiting a friend, and could she please not mention to anyone that I'd called? She said, "Honey, you don't sound fine." I said, "I know. I'll explain later. I love you." I hung up before she could ask anything else. What Strickland found over the following 3 weeks was more than I'd allowed myself to expect. My husband had been involved with his sister's coworker, a woman who administered medications at the same assisted living facility, for almost 2 years. The coworker had access to the facility's pharmaceutical dispensary through her administrative credentials. Strickland pulled her financials and found deposits from my husband's secondary account, one I hadn't known existed, totaling just over $18,000 across 11 months. The tox panel I'd had run came back positive for a benzodiazepine compound at a level consistent with repeated low-dose exposure over time, not a single event. My pharmacist colleague reviewed the results and wrote a detailed professional statement about what those levels indicated. There were also emails. Strickland had a contact who knew how to obtain them legally through the right channels. I won't pretend I fully understood the process, but what came through was enough. My husband and this woman discussing the timeline, him asking if she was certain about the dosage, Her writing back, just keep it consistent. Small amounts, the coroner won't flag it as anything but natural causes in a woman her age with her symptoms. I was 29. I had no underlying conditions. My husband had apparently decided that the cleanest way to exit our marriage and collect $250,000 was to ensure I didn't outlive the policy's waiting period. I sat in Strickland's office and read those emails on his monitor, and I felt something move through me that I still don't have the right word for. It wasn't quite grief, and it wasn't quite rage. It was something older and quieter. It was the sound of 6 years reorganizing themselves in my memory until they made a different kind of sense. I want to be clear, I did not go back to that house alone. I did not confront my husband in the dark. I did not handle this myself in any movie-style way. Because I am a pharmacist and a practical person, and I understood that what I had was evidence, and what evidence needs is the right hands. Strickland brought everything to the Cook County Sheriff's detective he'd worked with before. The detective brought in the Illinois State Police Financial Crimes Unit because of the insurance fraud angle. My divorce attorney coordinated with the DA's office so that my civil interests were protected during the criminal proceedings. It took 11 days from the moment we walked into that first meeting to the morning 2 detectives knocked on my door, the hotel door where I was still staying, and told me they had executed the warrants. My husband was arrested at 7:43 in the morning. He was in the kitchen making coffee. I know this because Strickland called me as it happened, and I stood in my hotel room in my socks, and I pressed the phone hard against my ear and listened. His sister was picked up at the assisted living facility an hour later. The coworker who'd been supplying the compounds was arrested at her apartment that afternoon. The DA's office charged my husband with attempted murder and insurance fraud. His sister was charged with conspiracy and criminal facilitation. The coworker faced charges related to theft of controlled substances, criminal facilitation, and conspiracy to commit murder, because that's what it was, in the end, regardless of how quietly and gradually it had been unfolding. There was a preliminary hearing, then a grand jury, then the long, grinding machinery of prosecution that I won't detail here because most of it I experienced from a waiting room or a phone call or a forwarded email from my attorney. My husband pled not guilty. His attorney tried to argue the emails were taken out of context. The talks panel, the financial records, and Strickland's documentation made that argument very difficult to sustain. He was convicted on both counts. The judge sentenced him to 22 years. His sister received 7 years under a plea agreement that required her full cooperation. The coworker received 9 years. The insurance company, after a great deal of correspondence between my attorney and their legal team, declined to pay out the policy naturally since no death had occurred. However, their fraud investigation unit offered a formal reward for information leading to the exposure of the fraud scheme, which is standard practice and entirely legal. That reward, combined with the civil judgment I obtained against my husband for intentional infliction of harm, meant that by the time the dust settled, I was not left with nothing. I was left with the house in Naperville, which I sold. I was left with my career, which I returned to on a Tuesday morning in February, and my supervisor hugged me in the break room and didn't ask any questions I didn't want to answer. I was left with my mother, who drove up from Springfield and stayed for 2 weeks and slept on the air mattress in my hotel room without complaint. I was left with myself, which took longer to come back to than anything else. I moved to a smaller city in Wisconsin about 8 months after the arrests, a place where nobody knew my husband's name, where I could go to a grocery store without running into someone who would look at me with that particular expression that people wear when they know something terrible has happened to you and don't know whether to say so. I got a position at a hospital pharmacy there. I bought a second-hand couch and a coffee maker and a plant I have somehow kept alive for almost a year, which feels like a genuine accomplishment. I don't host wine nights. I may never host wine nights again, and I've made peace with that. What I haven't fully made peace with, what I think about in the quiet hours, the ones that used to feel warm and now just feel quiet, is how long I explained it away. How many mornings I woke up and chose a reason that didn't require me to look directly at what was in front of me. The stomach bug, the hereditary migraines, the wine intolerance, the exhaustion, my own body betraying me. I was a pharmacist. I understood compounds and half-lives and metabolic clearance, and I still spent 6 months telling myself I was the problem. I say this not to be hard on myself, I've worked on that particular habit, but because I think it matters. I think the part of the story that doesn't get told often enough is the part where a person who should have known better still found 100 gentle explanations before she found the true one. Because the true one was not gentle. And we reach for gentle things when we are afraid. The glass was always mine. He just got to it first for a while. He doesn't anymore.